As we suffered through the pandemic of this last year, one of the things that the pandemic of COVID-19 uncovered for us was the pandemic of racism that continues to rage, that so many of us had either turned a blind eye to or not fully been aware of. So in response to that pandemic, Congregation Shaarey Zedek stepped forward, and we formed a CSZ Equity Task Force to ask the question, what can we as a Shaarey Zedek family do to make a difference in the lives of people in color? How can we step forward in order to bring equity in this country? I'm very pleased that we will be hearing from one of the members of our Equity Task Force this Shabbat morning, and as we continue to honor and to celebrate this weekend in memory of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And she happens to be a new member of Congregation Shaarey Zedek, and we are simply delighted about it. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Danielle McGuire. Danielle is an award-winning author and historian of racial and sexual violence. Her first book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power, won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award and the Lillian Smith Award. Danielle is the editor with John Dittmer of Freedom Rights, New Perspectives on the Civil Rights Movement. She is currently at work on a new book about the 1967 murder of 3 young black men in the Algiers Motel murders in Detroit. Danielle's Journal of American History essay, It Was Like We Were All Raped, Sexualized Violence, Community Mobilization, and the African American Freedom Struggle, won the A. Elizabeth Taylor Prize for Best Essay in Southern Women's History and was reprinted in the Best Essays in American History. Danielle earned a PhD from Rutgers University and a master's and bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and has appeared on NPR, Book TV, CNN, MSNBC.com, and dozens of local radio stations throughout the United States, South America, and Canada. Her essays have appeared in the Journal of American History, the Journal of Civil and Human Rights, the HollywoodReporter.com, CNN.com, the Huffington Post, the Grio, and the Root. Danielle lives with her husband, 2 children, and I'm not going to pronounce the Lasapu. In our area. She is, of course, among our new members, and maybe most of all, Danielle, we look forward to celebrating, God willing, a Bat Mitzvah this coming spring. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure and my honor to welcome to our virtual bima, Dr. Danielle McGuire.
Thanks, Shabbat Shalom to everyone. It's really a delight to be here with you and to be new members of this really incredible congregation. So on this Saturday, before Martin Luther King Day, in the wake of last summer's mass movement for Black Lives and last week's siege on the Capitol, I thought we should get to know Dr. King a little bit better. I think we all think we know Dr. King. We know about his dream of a colorblind society where people should be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. We know he believed in nonviolence, and we know he gave an excellent speech at the March on Washington. That's pretty much all we know about him. And because of that, I think it's really interesting that he enjoys a 95% approval rating today. It's better than almost anybody. In fact, the simplified version of Dr. King is used so often by so many different people with so many divergent agendas, it's hard to know what he actually stood for and what he should be remembered for and which struggles he would actually identify with today. So this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few distinct periods in Dr. King's career to help us better understand him, the movement he helped create, and how we can use the tools that he left us to help make the world a better place. Because the truth is, we need the real Dr. King and his radical democratic vision, his political savvy, and his organizing techniques now, I think, more than ever. So I'm going to start with his role in Montgomery in the bus boycott of 1955-56. Oops, for some reason it won't let me change pictures. That's okay. Dr. King was only 25 years old when he moved to Montgomery, and he became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He moved into a Black community that already had firmly established activist roots, but it was still an environment poisoned by violent white supremacy and segregation. And so very few people there were willing to risk their lives to challenge the system. And while he was already opposed to things like colonialism and imperialism, and believed his congregants to join the NAACP and become registered voters, he wasn't an activist. And when Mrs. Rosa Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955, for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger, and local Black women called for a boycott, Dr. King didn't rush to join them. He wasn't the only person who held back either. Most Black leaders at the time did not expect Mrs. Parks' arrest to lead to a year-long movement that would ultimately help to change the world. They definitely didn't expect glory or fame. They were realists. What they expected was to be fired from their jobs, arrested by the police, and targeted for violence by the Ku Klux Klan. But someone had to put their name on the flyers for the mass meeting. Someone had to be in charge. So local Black activists and ministers chose Dr. King, not because they thought he would lead them to the promised land, but because he was the new guy in town. If anyone was going to be targeted and driven out of town by an angry mob of white people, they thought, well, let it be the new guy. They knew he was a decent speaker, most clergy are, but they didn't think he was anything special. They didn't really know him that well. What they knew was that he was the new young guy in town, and he had a lot less to lose than they did. He had no real choice in some ways, so he accepted the leadership role, and he went home to prepare a speech for the first mass meeting. When he arrived at the Holt Street Baptist Church, the place was packed, and an overflow crowd lined the streets outside. And even though he had just thrown the speech together, King's message that night reveals a lot about his philosophies, his motivations, and the strategies for change that he would call on again and again and again until an assassin's bullet stole him from us. First, he reminded his audience about the long history of racial violence and intimidation on Montgomery's buses. And he talked about the specifics of Rosa Parks' arrest. And he placed her singular humiliation into a long history of similar crimes against the Black community. He said, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. People get tired of being plunged across the abyss of humiliation, he said. They get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November. The room went wild. I mean, he got the whole place riled up. There were 5,000 people there. And he tapped into something really deep and profound, that kind of, pain and humiliation. And he knew at that moment, with that kind of energy, he couldn't just talk about how horrible they'd all been treated. He needed to find a way to transform that bitterness and despair into something else, like hope and righteousness. So he centered their protest in the traditions of American democracy and justice. And he used the Cold War, the most important foreign and domestic issue of the time, to make a dramatic point about what it means to be an American citizen. He said, if we are incarcerated behind the iron curtains of a communistic nation, we couldn't do this. If we were dropped in the dungeon of a totalitarian regime, we couldn't do this. He said, but the great glory of American democracy is the right to protest for right. And then he said, if we're wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution is wrong. He said, if we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong, and justice is a lie, and love has no meaning. By then, everyone was roaring with approval. The rafters were shaking. They were riled up. But he told his audience, he said, whoa, slow down. Look, we've got to focus on love, not on hate. And he didn't mean a kind of warm and fuzzy love, a kind of sentimental, squishy love. He meant love with accountability. Justice, he said, is really love and calculation. He said, love harnessed to power. He said, the God the Almighty God himself is not just saying through Hosea, I love you, Israel. He's also the God that stands up before the nations and said, be still and know that I'm God. And if you don't obey me, I will break the backbone of your power and slap you out of the orbits of your international and national relationships. That's kind of the key to King's philosophy. Love is not an empty sentiment. It's a powerful force. And when used the right way, it can do really powerful things. In some ways, King's issuing a threat here. He's saying, look, America, if you don't obey God or abide by the Constitution, if you don't make good on your promise of equality and justice while proclaiming to be the most free nation on earth, then there will be real consequences. God might slap you out of the orbit of your national and international relationships. Or he's saying, maybe we will. Finally, the last part of his speech at the Holt Street Baptist Church signals his understanding that Black people will be part of this big movement. When the history books are written in the future, he said, somebody will have to say, there lived a race of people, a Black people with fleecy locks and dark complexion, a people, he said, who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights. And thereby, they injected a new meaning into the veins of history and of civilization. And we're going to do that, he said. Now you can imagine, the room full of people was ecstatic. They were nuts. King explicitly undercut one of the key arguments of white supremacy by saying essentially that Black people in this struggle are morally superior to those who deny them equality. He gave everyone there an injection of pride, a purpose, and a philosophy. And in just a few minutes, he laid out what was a roadmap for future protests. One was to couch these protests in the language of American rights, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and our most beloved institutions like the Supreme Court. Two was to advocate love and nonviolence, a love that's bookended with justice, love that's backed up by pressure and coercion. Three, expose the gap between the rhetoric of American democracy, what we say, and the reality of what we do. Four, acknowledge that pain and bitterness, acknowledge the humiliation and despair, but then harness it to something positive. Give people something to live for, not just something to die for. He proclaimed hope over despair. Number five, turn the fear of individual risks into community fearlessness. Move from an I to a we philosophy. So this is interesting because in all of the mass meetings during the bus boycott, people would come and testify about their experiences of humiliation on the buses and with Jim Crow. And as they stood up and testified, the whole community would bear that burden together. That's an I to a we. So individuals didn't have to suffer alone. The community helped everyone move forward. And then six, use whatever tools are available to coerce change. In this case, it was economics. They knew they made up 80% of the riders on the bus, so they could stop riding the bus. And that would force an economic problem for the community. And then finally, use nonviolence as a moral and political weapon. You can see these strategies at work throughout the civil rights era. Nonviolence is too often dismissed as weakness, but it gives activists a moral edge. And Dr. King and others soon realized that in the new era of television, the well-dressed, nonviolent, church-going activists looked a lot better than a mob of angry and violent and, let's be honest, scruffy vigilantes. Those confrontational images went a long way towards garnering the support of white Northerners and political leaders. You can see the moral power of nonviolence, and I'm sure you can conjure these images even though I can't show you my slides. When Bull Connor released police dogs and water hoses on marching children in Birmingham in 1963, or in Mississippi in 1964, when the Ku Klux Klan and their allies in the sheriff's department murdered voting rights activists Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, or in Alabama in 1965, when Sheriff Jim Clark led an assault on voting rights activists, including a very young John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. By 1966, these strategies outlined in that very first speech that he gave at the Holt Street Baptist Church had yielded major legislative victories, including the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But as King and other movement leaders started to integrate housing or pushed for integration in northern cities like Detroit and Chicago and Boston, there was a growing sense that legislation wasn't enough, that racism was both structural and personal, that it was embedded in people's hearts and minds. Many whites abhorred violence and blatant injustice, but they weren't really ready to integrate and share power. True equality required significantly more resources and political sacrifices than most people were really willing to give. Even those who supported the Southern Civil Rights Movement were fundamentally unwilling to integrate their schools, their job sites, and their neighborhoods. In fact, one of the biggest stumbling blocks towards justice, King said in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, was not the avowed white supremacists like the Ku Klux Klan, but he said, quote, the white moderates who are more devoted to order than to justice. The vast majority of white people, he said, are, quote, uneasy with injustice, but unwilling yet to pay a significant price to eradicate it. That unwillingness to embrace real equality helped fuel both a right-wing backlash that sparked political campaigns of racists like George Wallace and the Black rebellions that burned through American cities in 1967. By then, historic court rulings desegregating public schools and major civil rights legislation had been in many ways nullified. Most laws were unenforced or evaded by politicians, and both unrepentant segregationists and silent white liberals agreed. Whatever legal gains the movement had made became, King said, naked frameworks or mockeries of law. In order to effect real change, systemic change, he said in his 1967 Riverside Church speech in Harlem, the United States needed to undergo a radical revolution of values. First, he said, the United States needed to end the war in Vietnam. He said that war was like a, quote, demonic, destructive suction tube that eviscerated the Great Society and disproportionately ruined Black lives. It was wrong, he said, to send Black men 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia that they do not have in Southwest Georgia and in East Harlem. Dr. King thought that the war, and I think militarism in general, was a much larger problem, and that America was sicker than he first thought when he began in 1955. He said America must rapidly shift from a, quote, thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. Because, he said, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, after that speech in 1967, King was eviscerated by every major media outlet, the New York Times, the Washington Post, everything. He was abandoned by all the major civil rights organizations. I mean, abandoned. And he was cast out of most liberal political organizations, and he was publicly ostracized. That summer, the summer of 1967, Detroit and hundreds of other cities witnessed violent uprisings. And charged with finding out why the riots happened, the Kerner Commission issued its report in early 1968, and it placed the blame on structural and systematic racism. The report said, and said lots of things, but this one stands out. It said, quote, what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. The Kerner Commission argued that only a massive investment in equality in education, jobs, and housing would make real change. It echoed King's call for a radical revision to our domestic and foreign priorities. And like most people, Lyndon Johnson ignored the report, denying both the causes and the solutions to racial unrest. A few months later, on March 14th, 1968, Dr. King spoke before a bitter and polarized audience in Grosse Pointe. He was exhausted, He had been demonized, he was demoralized, and he was full of despair. Some said he was in a really deep depression. He said he could not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there's an honest confrontation with the truth. And the truth, he said, is that racism sits at the center of our history and our present. He also said, we've got to get rid of the idea that progress is inevitable. Time, he said, is not neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. Progress is only possible through the tireless and persistent work of dedicated individuals. The most potent tool for change, he said, was, quote, militant, massive nonviolence. Nothing changes, he learned, until an issue is dramatized in a direct action way that highlights the gap between the rhetoric of freedom and the reality of injustice. And we see this clearly in the civil rights movement. Without Bull Connor's water hoses and German shepherds, there would be no Civil Rights Act. Without the murder of Viola Liuzzo in Selma and the attack on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, there would be no Voting Rights Act. These things mattered. These confrontations forced change. King was planning to do the same thing. He wanted to force a confrontation with poverty, with inequality. And so he was planning on launching the Poor People's Campaign in the summer of 1968, but he was assassinated 3 weeks after his visit to Grosse Pointe. Of course, hundreds of cities exploded in an orgy of trauma, anger, and grief. King's murder symbolized the death of his freedom dreams, but not the dream that most people assume today, not the dream of colorblindness, like I mentioned, or judging people by the content of their character. No, King's dream was much more radical. It was to fundamentally remake America, to make it live up to its promises, to, as Langston Hughes put it, make America what it has never been yet, and yet must be, the land where everyone is free. And while an assassination took Dr. King from us, we still have the tools and lessons he left behind, many of which he laid out in that very first speech in Montgomery in 1955 and used throughout his short but revolutionary life. We can use these lessons from the past to make change today. In fact, we saw them on display this summer in the George Floyd protests. At the center of these efforts to make America live up to its creed are basic tools and tactics. Hope for a better future, because hope powers purpose and despair leads to bitterness. An honest confrontation with history and the legacy of racism. Massive, militant, organized nonviolence. Direct action that causes a confrontation with injustice and forces people to choose a side. And, of course, you need love. Not some kumbaya false unity love that we're hearing about today, but love with accountability. Love that implements the demands of justice. With these tools and tactics, we can arm ourselves for change, and we can meet what Dr. King called the fierce urgency of now, with courage and with conviction. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.
I want to thank Danielle again for her beautiful words and teaching this morning. So important as we think about whence we've come and where we still have yet to go. So I wanted to just pause here. I know everyone just got muted, but I want to know if anyone has any questions that they want to ask of Danielle.
Question.
Please, Stuart.
Danielle, should we be more worried about the guy with the horned hat and the painted face, or should we be more worried about guys like Jim Johnson in the Congress, since he dresses so well?
Well, they feed off each other, right? I mean, none of the vigilantes who bombed the 16th Street Church or who attacked Freedom Riders at the Birmingham bus stop, or who attacked the buses on the Freedom Ride, or any of the violence that happened in civil rights movements, or bombed synagogues for that matter. None of that's possible without the kind of rhetoric and lies that politicians and so-called civic leaders spread. So I think they're one and the same. We should fear both of them, and we should do our best to fight both of them in the best way we can. They need
Thank
each
you.
other.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How is the Martin Luther King, his guide to judging people on the character of the content of their character rather than the color of their skin? How has that changed in today's world?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean. You know, King did believe people should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Obviously, that's what he was fighting for. The problem was that African Americans and too many people were judged by the color of their skin, not just judged by it, but relegated to second-class citizenship, right? And so I think that's an ultimate goal, but the larger problem remains that we do have a structural and systematic problem with racism that is both institutional and personal. So we do judge people by the color of their skin, even if it's subconsciously, and studies show that again and again. And so we have to work really hard to get that kind of bias and sort of ingrained, culturally absorbed prejudices out of our heads, and that takes work. It's not something you could just say, you know, I don't see color. Of course you see color. You know, you see that I have hair. You see that I'm wearing clothes. Like, you see what people look like if you have sight. So I think what we need to do is work to really fight against the biases that are associated with what we see. And we all have them.
I have a question, if that's okay, Rabbi.
Yeah, Janet.
Can you tell us more about what King's initiative was that he was working on prior to his death?
Yeah, King was working on the Poor People's March, and what he thought was necessary was to really conquer the problem of economic inequality in the United States. And he thought that that was one way to sort of create this radical revision of America. And he knew that economic inequality cut across race, and that if you could bring poor people together, you could bring together a mass coalition of people that could hopefully coerce and pressure Congress and the federal government enough that they could create a really great society, what Lyndon Johnson had hoped for with his war on poverty, but what King thought the Vietnam War had really destroyed because of its cost in both lives and dollars. So he was working on that. So he was trying to build a multicultural, multiracial coalition that would converge on Washington and pressure and coerce legislators to, you know, really make real the war on poverty. And I think that on some level that kind of a coalition was deeply threatening to the powers that be, because so long as it was a Black movement or a limited interracial movement, it could always be sidelined and scapegoated. Once you cut across race and ethnic groups and really challenged the problem of inequality and poverty, then you're talking about a real revolutionary remake of the foundations of our society. And a lot of people didn't like that. Oh, Janet, you're muted.
Sorry about that. What about when you made the discussion about that he was finally blasted out of his position, you in the New York Times and everybody just boo-hooed him. Can you talk a little bit about, I was lost on the connection of why that happened.
It was because King was one of the very first civil rights leaders and public personas to come out against the war in Vietnam. And he came out very forcefully. He had already made his feelings known to, you know, other civil rights leaders and even to the president. But in that speech in 1967, the Riverside Church speech, it's worth listening to and reading. You can Google it. He really, you know, steps out of his role as a civil rights leader and condemns America's war in Vietnam. And of course, there's an anti-war movement. King has been pressured to give his voice to that. He's resisted it, but he says he can't resist it anymore. He says he can't call for nonviolence honestly and faithfully, and not call out the war in Vietnam, not call out America's militarism. So he really took a leap. He stayed true to his own faith and belief in nonviolence, in peace. He was a pacifist, and he spoke out. And Lyndon Johnson was absolutely furious. Of course, Lyndon Johnson was going through his own difficulties as president politically. And most people just thought King needed to stay in his lane, as they would say today. And King defined that lane much more broadly than I think most people did. And he stood by it. He wouldn't back down. He said, this is my truth. And if I am a pacifist, and I believe in nonviolence, and I believe in love, and I believe in equality, then America needs to end the war in Vietnam.
I got a question, Danielle. First of all, I really enjoyed everything you had to say.
Thank you.
With the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, so often we heard in response to it, well, all lives matter. And I know what my response to that is, but I'm curious what you think Dr. King's response would be to that. I just want to make sure I have the right one. I'd rather articulate what he would have to say about that.
Sure. Well, I think he would understand that it was an attempt to diminish the effort by Black people to thrust into public view the inequality and violence they face, particularly by the police. That it's a way to diminish the movement and to diminish the issue. Right? Of course, all lives matter. King, of course, he would say, yes, all lives matter, but not all lives are targeted the way Black lives are. Not all people are treated with the disdain and disrespect and insecurity that Black lives are. So I think he would condemn that, and he would try to educate people about why that's true, but not to the point. And a way to really take the power out of their movement. It decenters Black lives, that statement. And the movement is to center Black lives because they're the center of the problem in regards to police violence. They're largely the targets of that violence. And so, to say all lives matter, it takes the power, it takes the purpose out of the movement. Even though we know all lives matter, but not all lives are treated the same by the police. We saw that dramatically at the Capitol, dramatically. But we see it in lots of different ways too.
I've always felt, I wish they had adopted it, Black Lives Matter too.
Exactly.
I think that's what it really means, but.
Mm-hmm. Danielle, I had a question. Thank you for your words of wisdom. I wanted to ask you what you thought Martin Luther King would say about the role of education in the schools, and what you think about the role of education, educating our children about, the real history, that's sort of in vogue, of really looking back at our very racist history, not only with regard to people of color, but our Native Americans as well. So what role do you think education plays, and what would Dr. Martin Luther King say about that as well, in your mind?
Well, Dr. King always said, until we have an honest confrontation with our history, we can't have a meaningful present. We can't move forward in any meaningful way unless we understand what has been. And so I think he would be in favor of a much more holistic education than what so many of us have received and what we witness today. I'm a civil rights historian, and my kids come home from school both Cranbrook and the local public school, and they learn like almost nothing about history. It's so simplistic and simplified and whitewashed, and it's painful because when something like the siege on the Capitol happens and people start talking about the Civil War or Reconstruction or the Confederacy, they don't understand, and so they become sort of servants to the media narrative of what it means. And a lot of times they don't really have a full grasp of the history and what it means. Even our Congress people are saying things that are beyond ridiculous when it comes to historical facts and realities. So I obviously King was in favor of education. He was in favor of equal education. He was in favor of an honest confrontation with our history. And that doesn't mean you wring your hands in despair over our past, or you assign blame people in the present for our past sins, but it's to understand it so that we can understand, the legacy of the past that we're living in, right? I mean, that's so important to Judaism, understanding our history and being clear about what happened so that we'd never repeat it, the bad parts at least, right? So King was always in favor of education and worked very hard, I think, in his speeches to educate people about both the reality of the moment and of the history. And you can see that all over if you read his speeches.
There seems to be some pushback though about, just as an example, I was working on a campaign this fall or for the last year. And when we would go door to door, people would talk about the curriculum. People were threatened by the curriculum, which was suggesting our country had a much more racist history, and we were all complicit than those people felt comfortable in owning. So there's pushback. So it's a challenge.
It is a challenge, and as with anything, the truth is hard, but you can't. The truth is what will set us free, and confronting the past doesn't mean we're stuck living in it, or that we need to pay the price for past wrongs, but we do need to acknowledge them and we need to understand it. And part of the reason why we need to understand the past is so that we have a very clear understanding of what's happening right now. So many people throw their hands up in the air and say, I don't understand this. I think it's easy to understand what's happening right now. It's part of our legacy. And because we haven't had that honest confrontation, and because we have ignored things like the Kerner Commission's, proposals for change solutions to racial violence and unrest, we find ourselves repeating them and then throwing our hands up in the air. Why is this happening? If we use the map of the past, we can much more clearly get to the destination of our future.
I have a question. Martin Luther King would be 91 today. What would he do about today's problems, do you think, considering the pandemic?
Well, you have to wonder if Dr. King was alive all these years, if we'd be in a different place.
True.
Right. I mean, in some ways, he was cast out of his leadership position by organizations who were afraid of his message on Vietnam, but eventually they came around. And Dr. King's call for economic justice, if he had been around all these years, maybe something would have been done. Maybe there'd be a larger coalition. Maybe he would have put together a kind of, interracial, interethnic movement that pressured the government to be better on these issues. So it's hard to, it's counterfactual history. I have no idea. I think he wouldn't be surprised by the rise of radical right-wing movement. He was living through one at the time of his death. George Wallace, right, is very much similar to Donald Trump in his methods and in his philosophies. I think Donald Trump is more dangerous actually than George Wallace was. But there was a right-wing backlash that King was, living in the moment. And some of you may remember what that felt like in 1967, 1968, after the Detroit uprising. The fear and the bitterness and the anger and the polarization that people felt. I mean, George Wallace got huge margins of support in the primaries in 1964 and 1968 in the North, right? I remember a story about him campaigning in Milwaukee, and I think it was in 1964, and he was running as a Democrat because the South at the time was still largely conservative but Democratic. It was the party that had been in power since Reconstruction, and it's segregationist. Before the South moved solidly Republican by 1968 and into the 70s. But when Wallace went to Milwaukee, he gave his standard Southern speech where it was super anti-Black. And he couldn't believe the way people responded to him. They were cheering him. They were thrilled. That's the message they wanted to hear. And he turned to his aide and he said, "Oh my God." He said, "That's it. That's it." He said, "Everybody hates Black people." And he thought he could take that and ride with it for the presidency, and he garnered like 20% of the primary in 64 and in some places even more in 1968. So, he had huge support in Detroit. He came to speak at Cobo, and I think it was sold out, standing room only. So, some of that shift from Union Democrats, working class Democrats who are part of a union in the North in places like Detroit, you could see their shifts to, Ronald Reagan in Macomb County in the 80s, and then not surprisingly their shift to Donald Trump. It's part of that history. So, and King understood that any kind of pressure to move forward in terms of racial progress ignited a backlash, right? So he would recognize this. But he would, I think, help drive organized responses to it and help curate the message better.
Would you say that
Danielle,
go ahead.
If I could jump in, Danielle.
Ready. Thank you.
Stuart, we're going to let everyone have a chance here.
I'll shut up.
So I want to just jump in, Danielle, and ask you, part of what Dr. King was trying to achieve, that he did achieve in many ways, was to have those who are powerful share some of that power with those who are historically powerless. And you spoke about how Dr. King, used the media and imagery to evoke notions of change, that change needed to occur. I'm just curious, how does that happen? What was it within those images? What was it within what Dr. King did? And how did it affect those who had power? Was it that they felt shamed? Was it that they all of a sudden perceived the justice that Dr. King was trying to say, that there was injustice and we needed to achieve justice? How did Dr. King manage to get those who are powerful to at least begin to share power with those powerless?
That's a great question. And it's so interesting because, of course, King believed in nonviolence, but the truth is that a lot of the movement, in order to get that kind of change from the powerful, they had to go where there was violence. So, for example, in 1963 in Birmingham, they were looking for places to have a movement. They tried Albany, Georgia, and the sheriff there decided to tell everyone around, all of his deputies and all the citizens, leave the marchers alone. Don't confront them. Don't be violent. And the movement in Albany largely failed because there was no confrontation. So they're like, okay, who's the most racist, most reliably violent sheriff we can provoke? And they said, well, Bull Connor. So they went to Birmingham in 1963 and they started the marching there. And of course, Bull Connor was provoked, and he brought out the water. Sorry, my husband keeps calling me. Brought out the water hoses, and they brought out the dogs, and they attacked people. And they did that again and again. And of course, in order to be in the movement, if you were going to confront violent segregationists and white supremacists, you had to commit to being nonviolent. That was a big ask for most people. And it would be today. Most people are not turn the other cheek, kinds of folks. Like someone hits them, they're going to punch back. So this was a huge commitment, and they needed it. They needed that dramatic confrontation, and they needed it because they knew that it was the only way to bring the media. It was the only way to bring attention to the cause. Black people knew that Bull Connor was violent and that the Ku Klux Klan was violent and that they faced these kinds of threats every day, but most people couldn't see it. So they forced a confrontation, and the media likes confrontation. If it bleeds, it leads, they say, right, in journalism. So they brought the media there. And of course, we're engaged in this Cold War with the Soviet Union, and Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy are in the White House. And the front page is a picture of a German Shepherd attacking a child and kids being water hosed. And it becomes propaganda for the Soviet Union. Is this America? They said. And Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy said that those images sent America into the halls of palaces around the world with mud on their shoes. So they were shamed. They were embarrassed. It made America look bad. And it made America look like liars about who we say we are, right? And so that was their tactic, and they used it every single time. Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement had been asking for voting rights for years and years, and the federal government wasn't going to do it. Lyndon Johnson was like, look, once he became president, like we've done a lot. And so they planned the March to Selma. They knew Jim Clark was going to be a tough guy, a racist, that he was going to be violent, and they went anyway. They went to those places on purpose, right? So it's one of the kind of really interesting conundrums of history that nonviolence as a philosophy in many ways relies on a violent confrontation to showcase and highlight a kind of moral superiority and to force the powers that be to do something about the powerless. One of the most important things we forget is that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are really just enforcement mechanisms for the 14th and 15th Amendments. We already had equal rights in the Bill of Rights. We already had voting rights in the Bill of Rights, right? In the Constitution. So the laws are already there. It's just that no one's enforcing them. So this creates a kind of confrontation, and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act are enforcement mechanisms for the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Thanks. We have time, I think, for one or two more questions. Jackie?
Yeah, it's Jan. I've got my niece's thing on here. It's Jan Barris. You mentioned the Kerner report several times, and I remember not studying it thoroughly, but I certainly remember the report. Does it still have relevance today, or has our society changed too much? And just an add-on to something you were saying in your last answer, when you said that the media was so very important in forcing this change. One of the problems with today, and the reason why the Kerner report may not work, is that we're all siloed in our own media bubbles. And so what we see may not be what other people see, or at least see it in the same way.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're hyper polarized, and the internet and our access to media on the internet makes that even worse. That's a real threat to democracy and to our citizenry, and it's something we need to really work out. But the Kerner report is excellent. This is like a newer version that was just released for its 50th anniversary. And it's got a great foreword by a professor at Princeton. But you read it and it reads like today. All of the solutions are, I've got all the notes and everything for today. And so I think much of it is relevant. A lot of the problems that, that led to unrest in 1967 and 68 are problems we haven't solved. I've been surprised, frankly, that there hasn't been more violent unrest in the cities where poverty and inequality and access to opportunity is still so limited. a lot of people sort of shrug their shoulders like we don't understand why. Part of it, I think some people would argue, is that a lot of the people in those situations are in jail. And, you know, we've seen a massive rise of mass incarceration, a hollowing out of what King would have called the ghetto. But I think that the solutions offered, the insights of the current commission are very much relevant today, and it's worth a read, even a skim. Or you can read the reports on the 50th anniversary of it.
I don't know if there's one more question and then we can. All right, wonderful. So Danielle, from all of us, thank you so much for your wisdom and your kindness in sharing with us today and giving of yourself. We look forward, please God, many, many years of continuing to learn from you. I want to just take a step back too and remind the synagogue that we have a CSE Equity Task Force that is working hard to move the synagogue forward in terms of asking the question, what can we do to bring about change and to achieve equity and equality for people of color in our midst. So please stay tuned. You'll be hearing more from us. There's going to be a small group of us who are engaged in significant learning on this, and then we hope to bring it to the congregation on a larger level. So thank you. And I think we have lots of work to do if we want to fulfill our biblical mandate to pursue justice and certainly to offer compassion to all who are afflicted by this pandemic of inequality, persecution, racism, and oppression. So Danielle, thank you. Thank you again, Toda Rabah. Thank you everyone for sticking around. I appreciate it. I'm going to table for another time some of the learning I was able to engage this last week in learning with the Shalom Hartman Institute. So we'll table it for another Rabbi's Tisch. I can